Ghana's relationship with the West has been long-standing, and the best illustration of it, perhaps, is Ghana's relationship with the United Kingdom. History, of course, explains why that relationship is important, but even today, the importance of that relationship cannot be understated. As members of the Commonwealth, we continue to enjoy a special place in the hearts of the United Kingdom and vice versa. And today we're able to learn about how that relationship is evolving, how the Commonwealth's role in this ever-changing geopolitical landscape continues to be relevant. And to help us understand that, we're very honored to be speaking to the British Minister in charge of the Commonwealth and the United Nations, Lord Tariq Ahmed. Good morning, and thank you so much for your time with us. It's a pleasure to meet you. Of course, it's not great circumstances that bring you to Ghana. You're here for Kofi Annan's funeral. You knew the man well?
Yes, I mean, I didn't. I wasn't the Minister for the United Nations during his tenure, but I'm delighted to be leading a UK delegation, which also includes Lord Malloch Brown, who of course served with him and was a Deputy Secretary General as well. But we knew of the man, we knew of his work. The United Kingdom had a great fondness for the work of Kofi Annan, and it's a great honour for me, in my capacity as Minister of State at the Foreign Office, to represent Her Majesty's government here. And we're just coming from the service. It was a service reflective of the person he was, a person for all seasons, a man who committed himself to humanity, who committed himself to the United Nations in the true essence and principles of what is the United Nations. It's the bringing together of different people, different communities from all over the world for a common cause. Hassan, who was proud of his country, Ghana, and that was reflected. And a very personable man, as was demonstrated by the great affectionate tributes that were laid. But perhaps the most poignant, and understandably, the most poignant tributes were those from his own family. I'm a father. I've got 3 children myself, and sometimes in the professionalism and the role and honour of representing your country, and in the case of the revered Kofi Annan representing the world in his status as Secretary General, it's important also to remember that when that door is shut, you're also a family man, you're a father, you're a husband. And I think you could see that through his children and through his wife, about the strength of those personal relationships, because after all, those are what define our human values, and that was reflected. So it was a great honour to attend what was a very moving service, and I'm proud to represent the UK government in this relationship that we have with Ghana. You say it's circumstances, not the happiest of circumstances, but as I thought today, it was a true celebration of a man that just didn't make Ghana proud, he made the world proud for his commitment to peace and humanity.
And of course, he's been described as a global icon. Tell us what Kofi Annan represented to the British government.
Well, I think, you know, his description and indeed service, perhaps, as his spirit looks down upon us, knowing and reading about the man, he'd probably look about it and saying, what's all this fuss about, you know, in terms of what I did my job. And I think therein lies the sense of the respect that the British government, indeed across government, we all had for Kofi Annan in his style, which was very understated often. At a time of crisis, he kept his cool and calm. As Kipling famously said, you know, if you can keep, you know, calm amongst those who are losing their heads, then it's reflective of a person who was the right person for the right job. Because mediation, as I saw very recently when we I had the honour of chairing a Security Council debate at the UN, mediation is key. And I think Kofi Annan, in the role he played on the world stage, really epitomised that, and that was reflective in, of course, in 2001, his award of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think his commitment to peace, his commitment to humanity, we often talk about global shared values. Those were reflected in his person.
Yeah, there was a lot he did even after he left office, globally still, and he has a foundation that continues to give even after his departure. Going forward, what do you feel the legacy of a man like Kofi Annan will be to the world, and particularly to people of the UK?
Well, first of all, I mean, there was a lovely moment during the service this morning where there was a quote from Nelson Mandela. who, addressing Kofi Annan, said, "Kofi, I know you have retired, but you have to retire from retirement." And it was then suggested, as you rightly articulate, that whilst he'd moved on from his role as Secretary General, he was a person who was unrelenting in his commitment to find solutions to conflicts around the world. Very recently, on a very personal note, I chaired a session of the Security Council on Burma, on Myanmar, and the efforts of Kofi Annan in that respect, I hope, will be a lasting legacy to find true justice for the people, particularly the Rohingya community in Burma. And I think that reflects that to his last moments across not just Africa, but across the globe. The name Kofi Annan resonated strongly for finding solutions to often, many would say, intractable problems. But he found them and he committed himself. And I remember in my last visit here to Ghana, there was a moment I visited the Kofi Annan Centre, and I saw the wonderful and diverse work that's being done under a centre that carries his name. And there was a lovely moment also, one of the key priorities for our government, the British government, is the scourge of human trafficking, forced labour, modern slavery as we term it. And our Prime Minister has prioritised that particular issue. There was an occasion during that visit, I met a young man in his 30s now, I think, who himself at one time was put into this human trafficking chain through members of his own family. He was into forced labour in untangling nets right here in Ghana. But here was a man of great conviction who took upon himself, and I was meeting him as a head of an NGO committed to eradicating that particular scourge. And his name was James Kofi Annan. So you can see where his parents got the inspiration. And that legacy on a very personable level and a level of institutions that carry his name, but in terms of his continued commitment to literally his last day on God's earth, about continuing in finding peace, not just for his country, and I'm delighted to see the progress Ghana has made, but beyond that, beyond the borders of Ghana, within West Africa, across the continent and beyond. And the world owes him a big debt for the work he did. And I hope people like myself, who are now carrying on in our own way the work of human rights — I'm the Human Rights Minister, as you rightly articulated, I'm the Minister for the UN — that we take personal inspiration, as I do, for the work and his commitment. I often say, how do I define myself? And I found those definitions very reflective in Kofi Annan's work: a man of principle, a man who persevered, and a man of deep faith who believed in prayer, and that reflects some of my own personal motivations.
Let's talk a bit more about what you do on a daily basis. Of course, as Minister for the Commonwealth and the UN, you show your face at the two organizations which, from the British perspective, are the most sort of globally encompassing. But how relevant are these organizations today compared to yesteryear? I mean, is there still, with all of the protectionism that we are starting to see with Brexit, with America First and so forth, is the UN, the Commonwealth, as relevant as it once was?
Well, I think it is. We're very much committed to the international rules-based system. When people argue and criticize the United Nations, my counter-argument to them is, what would you put in its place? Instead of the United Nations, what would you perceive? Who would fill the void? And there is no answer to that. And yes, the United Nations needs reforms, and Secretary General Guterres is leading that. The UK government, as a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, is working very much on that agenda and closely with the Secretary General. You know, it's got to get an organisation which is fit for purpose. It needs to reflect the priorities on the global stage, and I think the Secretary General is very much committed to achieving those, and we are very supportive of those reforms. And so its relevance is very clear. I use the example of Myanmar, Burma earlier. If you look back over the last 14 months, I've seen myself, since my appointment as a Foreign Office Minister, over that 14-month period, we've gone from, there was no access for the United Nations to Myanmar, there were no agreements in place between Bangladesh and Myanmar government. Indeed, on the Burmese Myanmar side, there was not even an admittance of any fault that somehow these refugees were just appearing, and it was no fault of the government. If you fast forward 14 months on, we've gone from closed sessions of the Security Council to a presidential statement of all Security Council members agreeing, whilst we pursue a resolution. We continue to work collectively on that. Recently in the debate, again, we saw how Bangladesh itself is lending support, how the world communities come together in supporting these desperate refugees who have been ethnically cleansed from their own country and their own homes. And equally, we've seen now agreements in place between the Myanmar government with the United Nations, between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and that's down to the fact we've seen Pramila Patten, who is the special representative of the Secretary General, visiting the area, visiting Burma, and actually seeing for herself some of the challenges on the ground. Now, this is in a 14-month window, which I share with you because I've seen it myself. It's a practical example of how working collectively, collaboratively, that the United Nations family can move together to tackle some of the genuine challenges, issues and problems of the world.
So that's the UN. How about the Commonwealth?
Well, the Commonwealth, we were honoured, and you're rightly articulated. What is the Commonwealth, first of all? You know, I would say it's quite unique. It's this incredible 53 nations now, with the Gambia joining, and I can assure you, when I travel around the world, there's plenty of country knocking on the door, wishing to learn more, hear more about the Commonwealth. It's this incredible combination of countries brought together, yes, collectively as a 53, the member-to-member relationship that we have. A great example, an illustrated example of that is the relationship between the UK and Ghana. And the third element is the real strength of the Commonwealth, is its networks, its legal networks, its professional networks, its business networks. And that puts the Commonwealth in quite a unique position. If you reflect back to earlier this year in the April communique, with all the challenges of the world, with all the issues, we had agreements on cyber security, we had agreements on climate change, we had agreements on chemical weapons. That can't be achieved unless there's a real political will across these 53 quite diverse nations which span the globe, from your small Pacific island states to developing states in Africa to large states like India, and from a Western perspective, countries like ourselves, the United Kingdom and Canada and Australia, but actually coming together as the Commonwealth family to move together on important issues that matter. And I was delighted by the outcomes. In terms of its relevance, it's judged by the need now to build greater resilience into ensuring we see delivery from the decisions taken. But that work has to continue, and I think the nature of the Commonwealth will be reflected if we look back 5 years from now to see the strength of the decisions that were taken in London earlier this year in how those are being delivered. Because an organisation that doesn't deliver, you're quite right to say, people will then challenge as its reasons for existence, and we've got to make sure we stay on track.
You've talked about the need for political will in order for everything that the Commonwealth represents to actually bear fruit. But the fact that I'm about to ask you this perhaps is an illustration of the reason why this question is important. Because as a Ghanaian and as a viewer, I have a feeling they're probably sitting there now thinking, what's in it for me? How do I, a Ghanaian, benefit from the fact that my country belongs to the Commonwealth?
Well, I think first of all I pay tribute to your president. When the president himself met, he's someone I've known well over a number of years. He himself has been a great beacon for opening up Africa, opening up the corridors of West Africa in particular to the world. And what are the benefits of the Commonwealth? There's common legal systems, common education system, common languages, common sense of not just our history, but of the future. Now, I used to be in business for 20 years. I'll give you one practical benefit of the Commonwealth. You know, if I was about to go into a negotiation and do a deal, if someone told me, Tariq, here are the common structures, you've got the same legal system behind that contract, you've got a similar structure in terms of how the negotiations will work, the language that will be used in the contracts is shared. Actually, you're onto a winner, because if you look at the statistics themselves, there's an incredible demonstration of the deals that are done are much more cost benefit to each country. They're cost effective to the corporations involved. And in terms of Ghana specifically, you know, we're working with Ghana very closely on this vision of Beyond Aid. And it's about trade, it's about prosperity, it's about education. You look at the Chevening scholarships between the United Kingdom and Ghana. You look at the relationships we have in terms of the growth of businesses and business representation, increased levels of funding which are now being provided to bolster business and trade. Those are examples of how the Commonwealth works collectively, but also importantly for a country like Ghana in opening up new opportunities.
Things used to be different. There used to be fewer barriers, if you will, between Commonwealth countries. That's not the case anymore. First of all, rather than ask how we got here, let me ask, what's the benefit of this to the countries that are not the United Kingdom or Australia or Canada? Countries that perhaps the only way they would have benefited from being affiliated with countries like these would have been the free access, which would then boost trade and all the other things that we want to achieve. Now that those barriers are up, how do the smaller countries, like African countries, how do they really benefit from being part of Commonwealth?
Well, I think one of the examples of that most recently was our Prime Minister, Mrs. May, when she visited Africa recently. She was in South Africa, Kenya and Nigeria. I recently have also returned myself from Sudan. It's an example. We have a brand new African strategy as far as the British government's concerned, but the Commonwealth is intrinsic to that. In terms of direct benefits, you've talked about barriers to trade as how we can facilitate more effective trade, and that facilitation comes through common structures, bigger levels of investment. There's work to be done on both sides in increasing how this can sort of come together. But I'll give you one practical example. I'm a great believer in practical examples. I referred earlier to the outcomes from the Commonwealth Summit. There was a declaration on cybersecurity. We've been challenged ourselves in the UK with the growth of technologies, the opportunities it offers. There's also sinister objectives by some. They could be non-state actors, they could be state actors. There was a commitment from the Commonwealth, not just in terms of agreements, but money committed. So if you are that small island state that doesn't have the technical capacity, doesn't have the facility or the money to actually even conduct a cyber audit, well, the Commonwealth provides the solution to that. So that's a practical working example. So if you're a small island state in the Pacific or the Caribbean, you can now look towards the Commonwealth to actually find a solution. But it's about partnerships and collaboration. And the partnership that we have between Ghana and the United Kingdom is a valued one. It's bilaterally strong through the common links we have. I mean, I celebrate incredibly the diaspora, the British diaspora. They're ours. I always say that. They're ours to keep, but their origins lie in the beautiful country that is Ghana. Those are built through education ties, family ties, cultural ties, and for the future, the importance of prosperity and trade, and that's where I believe the focus should be.
Here's how I'd like us to wrap up.
Do you get to choose, or do I?
It's my proposal.
It's your program.
It's my proposal. Here's how I'd like us to. This is what I'd like us to end on. As the world changes, I mentioned Brexit and so forth. China starts to make incursions into Africa and into Commonwealth countries, building relationships that didn't used to exist. Is the Commonwealth concerned about this? What's the position? What conversations do you have with Theresa May about China?
Well, you know, China's an important trading partner to many countries, and Britain's not an exception to that. We value our bilateral relationship with China, and you're quite right to point out when you look across the continent of Africa, you see growing Chinese influence, but there's other countries as well. Turkey has, as I've seen myself in Accra, has extended its influence. But you know, I come from a private sector background. We welcome competition. We welcome the fact that there are different people seeking to invest in Africa. I think that's great for Africa. It's great for a country like Ghana. But I think through the Commonwealth, and importantly through the commitment we're making on a bilateral basis, you know, this whole issue of greater prosperity, greater trade, there's extra committed, not through words alone, but money as well. We're talking up to £1 billion, which would come through that relationship. We're holding an investment seminar. Come to Ghana, invest in Ghana. For who? For British business. But it's bilateral as well. We want to see greater levels of exports from Ghana to the UK. And the key to that, which we have over China, is the diaspora. We need to leverage those diaspora to make it work for the benefit of Ghana, for the benefit of the United Kingdom, and yes, for the benefit of the Commonwealth as well.
Lord Ahmad, we have to do this again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.